Hello and welcome to Byjus Exam Prep. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. Let's get started with an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the issue of electoral freebies, or basically populist schemes that are announced by political parties in the run up to elections in order to entice the voters during electoral campaigns. I'm sure many of you would have heard about political parties that promise free electricity and free water. They even promise to distribute free laptops, bicycles, or tractors if elected to power. They also announce several populist schemes targeted at farmers, rural voters, and they commit to waive off their loans if they are voted to power in the upcoming elections. So it's a common practice for political parties, especially at the state level, to make such grand promises in order to attract and entice the voters and to push them to vote for their parties. So once a party is elected to power based on these promises, the next government would be obliged to fulfill these commitments, and they end up launching these irrational schemes, which ends up imposing a huge cost on the state's exchequer. In fact, many state governments even go to the extent of borrowing heavily to fulfill these electoral promises. And even though the state's revenues are not in good condition, they end up borrowing a lot of money, which eventually pushes the states into a massive debt burden. According to estimates, the debt burden at the level of state governments stands at a massive 70 lakh crore rupees. And most of this burden would be a direct result of irrational spending as a result of these populist electoral promises. So this issue not only affects the economic stability of the state governments and the country as well, but also violates the core tenet of democratic elections and derails the very concept of free and fair elections, because these populist schemes and electoral freebies that are promised, it essentially amounts to bribing the voter and amounts to exercising undue influence on the voter. So this key electoral issue was recently brought up at the Supreme Court, and yesterday Supreme Court has made some very important observations. The Supreme Court has labeled these populist schemes and electoral freebies that are announced by parties during electoral campaigns as irrational poll freebies, which end up harming the economic state of the country. So the Supreme Court has directed the central government to look into this issue and work with the Finance Commission that is constituted under Article 280 of the Constitution to come up with a mechanism to curb the announcement of such electoral freebies by political parties. Legal experts who argued in front of the Supreme Court in this case have pointed out that the Finance Commission can create a disincentive for political parties and state governments by linking its allocation of revenue to states to the respective states' debt burden, thereby pushing the state governments and the state level political parties to be more concerned about the debt situation and thus dissuading them from promising such electoral freebies which are economically irrational. One of the lawyers in the case also argued in front of the court that such parties which promise populist schemes and electoral freebies, their election symbols should be taken away by the Election Commission by making suitable changes to the Election Symbols Order of 1968. And it was also suggested that such parties should be de-recognized and deregistered in order to prevent them from contesting elections. But however, the Election Commission of India rejected these arguments because constitutionally it's not possible to take away the symbols of political parties or to deregister the parties for promising electoral freebies. So one way forward would be for the Finance Commission to create a disincentive for the state governments to prevent such unnecessary expenditures so that parties can be deterred from announcing these populist schemes which are economically unviable. The other route is for the Law Commission of India to review all the existing laws so that the legal loopholes can be plugged through which political parties can be prevented from announcing such populist measures. So to evaluate these options and to come out with a solution, the Supreme Court has directed the Government of India to consult the Finance Commission and submit a report so that a viable and permanent solution can be found to this key issue. Now let's take up a very important and interesting column from page number 6, written by Praveen Chakravarti. In this column, the writer examines whether GDP or gross domestic product is the best way of measuring growth and development in a country. In fact, this has been a long-standing question because today most countries are obsessed with GDP-led growth and they often have a single-minded pursuit of improving their GDP numbers without considering the fact whether this statistical growth truly reflects economic growth on the ground and, more importantly, societal development at the grassroots. See, as you all know, GDP is a standard measure of the value added or created through the production of goods and services in a country during a certain period. This definitely is a measure of the range of economic activities taking place in a country. But the question is whether this statistical measure does it truly reflect growth and development for the common people? See, at the end of the day, what does growth mean for the common man? It would obviously include financial stability, accompanied with sufficient purchasing power to access all basic essential services. This, of course, is directly tied to one's livelihood and the income that one is generating. So, no wonder those who have a stable job, especially in the formal sector, and those who draw a regular and reliable income report a better standard of living. So, the writer questions whether GDP growth in a country does it truly translate to job security and basic income guarantee for the people at the grassroots. The writer is strongly of the opinion that GDP growth alone does not guarantee societal growth and development. To justify his argument, he compares India's GDP figures over the last 3 decades with India's employment data that was previously being brought out by the RBI. A comparison of this data shows that in the decade between 1980 and 1990, every single percentage of GDP growth was roughly generating around 2 lakh jobs every year. In the next decade between 1990 and 2000, this reduced by half and every 1% of GDP growth was generating only around 1 lakh jobs. This has declined even further between 2000 and 2010, where 1% GDP growth has generated just around 52,000 jobs every year. After this, RBI stopped coming out with this employment data in 2011-2012. But based on other reports, the writer says that it is safe to assume that despite consistent GDP growth over the last 10 to 12 years, the number of jobs that 1% GDP growth was generating has gone down, thereby directly affecting employment levels in the country, which in turn affects the overall well-being of the common man. So essentially, according to the writer, GDP growth simply does not translate into true growth and development at the grassroots. The writer points out that the direct correlation that existed between GDP growth and creation of jobs in the formal sector has weakened over the decades. And that is the reason why the writer is advising the governments to not be obsessed with GDP numbers alone and to give up their single-minded pursuit of GDP growth. See, no doubt, GDP is a good indicator with regard to economic progress. It definitely helps in comparing the increase in economic activities, that is, with regard to production of goods and services over a given period of time. It is also a good comparison tool for measuring economic growth between different countries. But however, this is not the sole indicator. It's not the only indicator to measure actual societal well-being and growth and development at the grassroots. In fact, this is what even Nobel-winning economist Simon Kuznets believed. Simon Kuznets was the one who conceived the concept of GDP, and he truly believed that GDP is a good statistical measure for measuring economic performance. But he had clearly warned that GDP numbers alone does not refer to societal growth and development. And you also see a similar policy being adopted by few countries like Bhutan, which have given up a single-minded blind pursuit of GDP-led growth and instead measure their growth through a unique index known as the GNH or the Gross National Happiness Index. While the GNH model is well suited for Bhutan's unique society, it may not be suited for other countries, but that doesn't mean the other countries should blindly focus on GDP statistics, because it will lead governments and even the political parties to look at only half the picture, thereby resulting in the neglect of other key economic parameters. Over the years, GDP-led growth has been hyped and overemphasized, not just by governments and political parties, but even by global institutions like World Bank and IMF. So when GDP numbers are brought out every quarter and every year by these institutions and by governments, it either leads to a lot of euphoria when there is massive growth or leads to dejection when there is a decline in GDP growth. Essentially, it has led to an unhealthy obsession where policy makers at the level of governments and even central banks have become obsessed with GDP numbers. This is where the writer cautions India and the rest of the world to take a lesson from Sri Lanka's example. As you know, today Sri Lanka is facing its gravest economic crisis. But interestingly, over the last few years, Sri Lanka's GDP numbers was doing fairly well. But the ruling class never really got a hint of the sufferings of the common people because on the ground, Sri Lankans were struggling for jobs and a basic livelihood. See, now it's very important for a government and even for political parties to pay attention to this aspect because eventually all government policies are designed based on the parameters that are being measured. If our obsession is only with GDP numbers and policies are designed around it, it leads to the neglect of several other key socio-economic factors on the ground, and this could have disastrous consequences to the very future and survival of electoral liberal democracies. This happens to be the case not just with developing and underdeveloped nations. Even if you look at Western countries, even if you look at China, their GDP numbers do not correlate with the jobs that are being created and definitely does not correlate with overall societal growth and development. So when countries are reporting year-on-year GDP growth, and if this is not translating into jobs and well-being for the common people, it leads to a disenchantment amongst the people and the voters, and could lead to a situation where people start losing faith in liberal democracies. He points out that this could be a possible reason why even European voters in a developed region have started swinging towards radical parties in recent elections, as they are losing faith in liberal democratic parties. Hence, he says that it is high time for India to consider this anomaly between GDP growth and lack of societal growth, and he calls for a complete overhaul of India's economic performance measurement framework. In fact, France had made an experiment with this back in 2008 when then French President Nicolas Sarkozy had set up a commission on the measurement of economic performance and social progress by appointing leading Nobel laureate economists onto the task force, which included the likes of Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen. Even this French task force had recommended that GDP-led growth alone may not be the true indicator of growth and development, and had suggested the measurement of multiple indicators and parameters in order to gauge true societal well-being in a country. So according to the writer, that is exactly what India needs as well. And it is high time for the government and the opposition parties to realize that while GDP is a good indicator for measuring economic progress and activities, it may not be the sole measure for evaluating societal growth and development. Now let's take a look at a column and an editorial from page number 6 and 8 that evaluates the current political situation in Myanmar. See, Myanmar has seen a history of political turmoil because back in 1960s, Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, had overthrown the then democratic government and captured power through a military coup, and the military junta had ruled the country with an iron fist, at least until 2010, and during this entire period, the military junta had blatantly violated democratic rights and human rights in the country. It had brutally crushed every uprising, including the pro-democracy movement of 1980s, which was led by Aung San Suu Kyi and a political party, the NLD, or the National League for Democracy. As a result of these large-scale violations, Myanmar had been targeted by Western countries through economic sanctions. And finally, under the pressure of these sanctions, Myanmar's military decided to step aside in 2010 and introduced a partial democracy or a quasi-democracy, which lasted only until 2020. Between 2010 and 2015, elections were introduced in the country, but still the military retained majority representation in the parliament. But as the Western countries were not impressed and they didn't lift the economic sanctions, Myanmar's military went for a bigger transition towards democracy in 2015 through which the NLD won the elections and formed the government for 5 years. This was a relatively stable period for Myanmar, but all the while, the military was still controlling key decisions, even when there was an elected government. But eventually, this quasi democracy setup finally fell apart following the 2020 elections, when the NLD again won the elections and was all set to form a full majority government. This outright victory of NLD in elections led to panic within the military, and the Tatmadaw not only disputed the election results and made baseless allegations of electoral fraud, but it even nullified the results and declared a state of emergency in 2021. This was again an attempt by the military to capture power, and since then Myanmar has fallen back under military rule. But the people of Myanmar rose up in rebellion, and over the last 1.5 years, they have been leading an uprising against Myanmar's military in order to restore democracy in their country and to protect their rights. But as expected, Myanmar's army has retaliated with force and has tried to crush the rebellion, and hundreds of innocent civilians have been killed. And even 2 days ago, on the 25th of July, Myanmar's army executed a few pro-democracy activists in order to strike fear amongst the protesters, in order to break up the uprising. So in this context, the editorial and the column points out that such brutal acts of repression by Myanmar's army will only lead to the strengthening of resistance by the people, and the political and humanitarian crisis is only going to get prolonged, which in fact has the potential to destabilize the entire region as well. This is where the articles point out that the international response against Myanmar's military has been weak, because even though Western countries have reimposed their sanctions, it has not been effective enough, and key regional players like the ASEAN group, China, and even India haven't criticized Myanmar's military for these developments and haven't stepped up diplomatic pressure, as all the regional players are driven by their respective national interests. In fact, in the case of India, it has been following this policy towards Myanmar since many decades, where it has never criticized Myanmar's military for its internal atrocities. Because for India, Myanmar is a key neighbor with regard to its national security and border security, as India tackles the challenge of insurgency in the northeast and rampant organized crime along the India-Myanmar border. So this has led India to adopt a very realistic position towards Myanmar, but eventually the inadequate international pressure on the country has led its military to abuse human rights and democratic rights, thus leading to this dire situation in the country. Now let's take up an article from page number 12, which deals with the CPEC project and India's stand on it. See, the CPEC project stands for China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which happens to be an ambitious project led by China as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Through this economic corridor, China is seeking direct access to the Arabian Sea by building a series of road and rail networks and oil and gas pipelines, along with industrial clusters that will link China's Xinjiang province over here to the strategic port of Gwadar, located over here in the Balochistan province of Pakistan, that faces the Arabian Sea. For China and as well as for Pakistan, the CPEC project has been a top priority initiative, and have even accelerated the construction activities over the last few years. But India has strongly opposed the project, and in fact, the alignment of the CPEC project is the reason why India boycotted the Belt and Road Initiative itself. Because if you look at the map, it's very clear that the CPEC project passes through territory that is claimed by India as part of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. This region that you're seeing over here is under the illegal occupation of Pakistan, and India refers to this whole region as POK, or Pakistan Occupied Kashmir. The Gilgit-Baltistan region over here is not only under Pakistan's illegal occupation, but Pakistan has even ceded away a part of Indian territory known as the Shaksgam Valley to China through a border agreement that was signed back in 1963, immediately after the 1962 war between India and China. So essentially, Pakistan not only occupied Indian territory, but later also ceded away a part of this territory to China, and it's through this Indian claimed territory that the CPEC project is passing through. So essentially, the alignment of CPEC project violates India's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and hence India has strongly opposed the project. And this is primarily the reason why India quit and boycotted the Belt and Road Initiative of China. But despite India's strong objection against the CPEC project, the two countries have gone ahead with their initiative, and recently they even held a meeting through which they've tried to bring Afghanistan also under the project, thus raising serious concerns for India. Because as you know, currently Afghanistan is under the rule of the Taliban, and even though India has been trying to reach out to the Taliban government, it is still not certain as to how India's ties will evolve with the new Afghan government. In the past, India and Taliban have had hostile relations, and considering Taliban's proximity to Pakistan, any such Afghan involvement in the CPEC project could complicate India's claims over this part of Jammu and Kashmir, which has been illegally occupied by Pakistan. So, in this context, India's Ministry of External Affairs has strongly objected to the recent meeting that took place between Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan, and has opposed any third party involvement in this part of territory claimed by India. And India has reiterated that it not only opposes the CPEC project as it violates its integrity and sovereignty, but also strongly opposes the involvement of any new parties and third countries in this project. Now let's take a look at another important article from page number 12 that's related to environment and ecology. According to the article, India has added 5 more Ramsar sites, thus taking the total number of Ramsar sites in India to 54. See, you might have heard about the Ramsar Convention of 1971, which is an international treaty for the conservation of wetland ecosystems. Wetlands, which can be both natural or artificial, represents a marshy area or even having geographical features such as fen or peatland, which is often saturated with a constant presence of water. These shallow water-filled marshy areas happen to be very rich ecosystems that are blessed with great biodiversity, including several threatened species of animals, plants, and birds. You also come across a very high degree of adaptation amongst organisms which inhabit wetland ecosystems, thus making them critical ecosystems for conservation. So, under the Ramsar Convention, wetlands of international importance are recognized, and India earlier had around 30 odd Ramsar sites. But in the recent years, more than 13 new Ramsar sites have been added, and today, with the addition of 5 new Ramsar sites, the number has gone up to 54 Ramsar sites in India. So please make a note of the new Ramsar sites that have been designated, and this includes 3 wetland ecosystems in Tamil Nadu, 1 in Madhya Pradesh, and 1 in the state of Mizoram. The names of these wetland ecosystems are the Karikili Bird Sanctuary, Pallikaranai Marsh Reserve Forest, and Pichavaram Mangrove Forest in Tamil Nadu. In Madhya Pradesh, it is the Sakya Sagar Wetland Ecosystem, and in Mizoram, it's the Pala Wetlands. With this designation, India's total Ramsar sites have a combined wetland area of around 11,000 square kilometers, and they are spread across 18 states. In fact, India has thousands of wetland ecosystems due to its geographical diversity. And according to ISRO's National Wetland Inventory and Assessment, India's total wetland ecosystems, they comprise an area of 1,52,000 square kilometers. Out of this, we have around 11,000 square kilometers of it covered under Ramsar Convention through 54 Ramsar sites that are spread over 18 states. But the countries with the highest number of Ramsar sites in the world happens to be United Kingdom with 175 Ramsar sites, followed by Mexico with 142 Ramsar sites. In terms of area, it is Bolivia, which is a South American country, as it has an area of around 1,48,000 square kilometers designated as part of Ramsar Convention. The uniqueness of such wetland ecosystems comes from the fact that they have a very rich and unique biodiversity comprising of several threatened and endangered species, including the mangroves, several aquatic water birds and migratory birds, and as well as unique aquatic species and large mammals, thus making it an important habitat for threatened and endangered species. So this map over here, sourced from the Wildlife Institute of India, depicts all the 49 Ramsar sites that existed in India. And please take a look at this table and also identify the states that they are located in. So now, with the addition of 5 new Ramsar sites, the total number of Ramsar sites in India has gone up to 54. Now coming to the last article on page number 10, two personnel from the Border Security Force who were deployed as part of the Indian contingent under the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo or the Democratic Republic of Congo have been killed during an anti-UN protest. This brings into attention the role of India in UN peacekeeping missions and the immense contribution that Indian soldiers have made to UN peacekeeping missions. See, over the decades, as a responsible member of the UN, India has been one of the largest troop contributing countries to the UN peacekeeping forces, and overall, India has contributed more than 2 lakh soldiers and police officers, including a number of women officers as well. Indian troops have taken part in at least 49 UN peacekeeping missions over the last 7 decades, and they have played a crucial role in stabilizing several countries that were hit by civil wars and conflicts. The troops that India sends to the UN peacekeeping missions, they're drawn either from the Indian Armed Forces or from India's paramilitary forces, that is the Central Armed Police Forces, and also from our police forces. Over the years, many Indian soldiers have made the supreme sacrifice during these peacekeeping missions, and it's because of this risk faced by UN peacekeeping soldiers that India also wants to have a say in how the UN peacekeeping forces are deployed, because these decisions are entirely controlled by the UN Security Council. Only the P5 countries, that is the 5 permanent members of UNSC, which includes US, China, Russia, UK and France, they get to decide on the deployment on the mandate of the UN peacekeeping forces, whereas the largest troop contributing countries like India and even Pakistan and Bangladesh are entirely left out of the decision making process. So as part of India's long-standing demand to reform the UN, India wants to ensure that the troop contributing countries also get to have a say on how the UN peacekeeping forces are used by the UN, because it is the troop contributing countries which are putting the lives of their soldiers at risk. But all decisions related to their deployment, safety and well-being are made by the P5 countries of the UNSC. In fact, to ensure the safety of UN peacekeeping soldiers, India recently developed a technology-based platform as well and a mobile application known as Unite Aware, which India has donated to the UN peacekeeping forces. And this technology-based platform helps the UN peacekeeping forces in carrying out surveillance and in monitoring the threats in the region where they have been deployed. Now, as we come to the end of the session, let's take a look at a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: promise of irrational freebies to entice voters during elections is a serious concern. Examine in the light of recent observations made by the Supreme Court on this issue. The second question: the sole dependency on GDP number as a metric for measuring economic growth and development is not recommended, given that GDP may not be a measure of societal well-being. Critically discuss. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So on this note, I would like to conclude today's discussion, and if you like the initiative, do let us know by pressing the like button, share your feedback through more comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.